And Hal, I've now got the great pleasure to introduce our next session. This is John Brockman and guests. John Brockman is a cultural impresario whose career has encompassed the avant-garde art world, science, books, software, and the internet. It's in 1973 that he formed Brockman Inc., the international literary and software agency specializing in serious non-fiction. He is the founder of Edge Foundation Inc., the non-profit organization, and also editor of Edge website, which is devoted to discussions of cutting-edge science by many of the world's most brilliant thinkers, the leaders of what he has termed the third culture. Including his works are many books. He is the author and editor of books such as by the late John Brockman, The Third Culture, Literati, Encounters with the Cyber Elite. In addition, he is also the editor of a series of books based on the Edge annual question, what we believe but cannot prove, what is your dangerous idea, and what are you optimistic about? The dialogue with John Brockman has been going on for many, many years. It actually all started thanks to Steffi Czerny, Marcel Reichert, Hubert Burda, and John and I every year moderate DLD sessions. It was in 2007 that John was very involved with our experiment marathon. First of all, by running the formulas by the Edge community. So there were many, many extraordinary formulas for the experiment marathon arriving from all over the world. Something which is happening again this year, where we're actually receiving maps from all over the world, which you can see on the Edge website. But in the experiment marathon, John also curated a whole section of presentations, and it was through this that we actually met for the first time, his two guests today, Louis Wolpert and Armand Leroi. So a very, very warm welcome to John Brockman, to Louis Wolpert, to Armand Leroi.
Thank you, Hans-Ulrich. Clouds are not spheres. Mountains are not cones, coastlines are not circles, and bark is not smooth, nor does lightning travel in a straight line. Benoit Mandelbrot died this week on October 14th. As much as anyone, his work 25, 30 years ago has inspired a lot of what we're seeing today. And I'm sure he would have liked to have been here. About a month ago, we got word he had pancreatic cancer and was given 4 weeks to live. He dealt with it in good humor, and he left behind an amazing legacy. I met him in 1977. Sought him out because I wanted to talk about his ideas, and we had dinner, and like Hans-Ulrich, I couldn't understand a word he said because of his accent. And it's never changed. I kept up with him over the years. We've had a lot of dinners, meetings. I eventually worked with him professionally, and he took great pride in the way he talked. But he was always charming and amusing and incredibly intelligent. Around 1980, I started something called the Reality Club with the late Heinz Pagels, which morphed into the online edge.org once the internet hit. These were live meetings where people would get up, present their work with the idea they'd be challenged. By far the biggest event ever was in 1985 when Mandelbrot appeared in a very large apartment, and everyone in the New York art world heard about it and wanted to come. I've never seen such a turnout. And it was the art world that gave me my background in science. It was John Cage handed me Cybernetics by Norbert Wiener, Rauschenberg fed me physics books, James Lee Byers, and I talked endlessly about biology. It was a very exciting time, and the artists in New York were picking up on ideas such as fractals and chaos and cybernetics and incorporating them into their work. Nam June Paik, Les Levine, and others made the 60s a very exciting time in that regard. I talked to Benoit in in 2004 in the talk we called A Theory of Roughness as opposed to a theory of fractals. He's best known as the founder of fractal geometry, which impacts on mathematics, diverse sciences, art, and was basically the first broad attempt to investigate quantitatively ubiquitous notion of roughness. Till the end, he was pushing the envelope with his theory. He said, there's a joke that your hammer will always find nails to hit, he says. I find that perfectly acceptable. The hammer I crafted is the most effective tool for all kinds of roughness, and nobody will deny that there is at least some roughness everywhere. In 2005, when we asked our annual question of the EDGE community, which was, what do you believe is true even though you cannot prove it, he responded with the following. Wandering through the frontiers of the sciences and the arts, I have always trusted the eye while leaving aside the issues that elude it. It can mislead, of course, therefore I check endlessly and never rush to print. Meanwhile, over 50 years, I've watched as some disciplines exhaust the top-down problems they know how to tackle. So they wander around seeking totally new patterns in a dark and deep mess where an unlit lamp is of little help. But the eye can continually be trained, and long ago I have vowed to follow it, therefore work, quote, from the bottom up, unquote. Like the Antaeus of Greek myth, I gather strength and persist by often touching the earth. A few of the truths the eye told me have been disproven, let it be. Others have been confirmed by enormous and fruitful effort and then blossomed, one being the 4/3 conjecture in Brownian motion, many others, one being the MLC conjecture about the Mandelbrot set, in which I believe for no other reason than trust in the eye. So Hans-Ulrich and I would like to dedicate this marathon to the memory of Benoit Mandelbrot. Now, turning to our distinguished professors, somehow I wound up with two biologists. I'm going to hear a lot about this. Indeed. These are people that don't have theories. You know, they just go in and they... Yeah, I mean, I usually like people that stand at the edge of the universe and look at awe and wonder, and they look at this stuff and, you know, messy stuff in their labs, worms, right?
Or people like yourself.
Yes.
Sorry, I don't know. Sorry.
Louis Wolpert is one of the great distinguished scientists of our time. He claims he's retired as professor emeritus at Imperial and
University College.
University. You went to Imperial.
A long time ago.
Well, that's, you know, we never forget these things. He's a developmental biologist. Armand Leroi is an evolutionary psychologist.
Evolutionary biologist.
Biologist, same thing. From Imperial. And also a raconteur and television personality. So I thought what we did is Hans-Ulrich is doing this map project, and basically he's doing the art world and I'm doing the science world, although there's some overlap, and a number of his artists are now participating on the edge.org site. I just sent an email saying, what's your map of the 21st century? And a lot of people called or wrote, what do you mean, what do you want? And I just played dumb and just, you know, let it be a Rorschach test. Maybe you know what a map is, I'm not that bright. So I thought we could start with Armand and Louis talking about their own maps. So maybe you could start. And,
sure.
Yeah, we have Louis's map here.
Thank you very much. So can I remind you, and you should certainly be aware of this every night before you go to sleep, you come from one single cell, the fertilized egg. Don't you find that a little surprising? That you were once that tiny little fertilized egg, a single tiny cell? It is remarkable. And that's what we developmental biologists work on. And the question is that cell divides into many, many cells, and eventually you emerge. And the question is, how do the cells know what to do? And one of the things that developmental biologists look at is an early map of the embryo. It's a map which shows which parts of the embryo are going to develop into what. And I've got some maps there. That's the frog map up at the top. This is the chick map up there, and this is a mouse map here. And, sorry, I've got these technical terms written here, but nevertheless, where it says neural, that blue in this one over here, or the blue in all, the dark blue, is going to give rise to the nervous system. Where it says endoderm, that'll give rise to the gut. The mesoderm gives rise to all the bones and muscles in the body. And the question is now, these are what are called fate maps. So the cells at this early stage have been labeled, and you see where they end up. Now, I must tell you, it's a fate map, it's not a specification map. It means that this is where those cells will normally give rise to. However, if you move these cells to another place, they won't. They'll behave largely according to where you put them. And that is later on a specification map. But the question is, how is this map actually built up? And I can't give you a whole lecture on developmental biology now, but just let me tell you some peculiar things about embryos. 100 years ago, a German biologist called Hans-Ulrich was working on sea urchin embryos. I used to work on sea urchin embryos. I used to go to Sweden, and it's very nice. It's easy to fertilize the eggs, and then the egg divides into two, and later on gives rise to a sea urchin larva. It goes on dividing. And what Drich did is when the fertilized egg divided into two, he separated them, expecting that what would happen is these two smaller cells would give rise to a half embryo. No, they do not. They give rise to smaller but totally normal embryos. And I want to tell you that happens with humans. Identical twins are initially half the size of normal twins. And the question is, if you think about mapping and patterning, that's absolutely remarkable. And in the case of the sea urchin, you can go to the 4-cell stage and separate them, and you'll get 4 1/4 size normal embryos. And what I want to suggest to you is that the early embryo is a bit like a flag. The point about flags is that they're invariant with size. I'm best known for what I call the French flag problem. And that is, a French flag, whether it's small or large, has the same pattern. And that's exactly the same with early embryos, including all early human embryos. And what I'm suggesting is, just when is not quite clear, that one way of thinking about patterning the early embryo is to think of it as a flag. That is, that there's some way in which the cells know their position and therefore know how to develop. And this gave rise to the concept of positional information, that there are clever ways that cells have of knowing their position, a coordinate system in the early embryo. And that coordinate system isn't quite a map, but it's a bit like a map, and your development is very, very dependent upon it. All right? Thank you.
Lovely.
Thank you. I just must also emphasize, we don't know the molecular basis. We do know about positional information in a different system. Certain amphibians, like salamanders, can regenerate their limbs. That's amazing. You cut the limb here, regenerate a hand. You cut the limb here, regenerate the arm. And we do now know from a work of a colleague of mine that there is positional information down the limb. There's a particular membrane protein which is graded high up here and low down here. So we're making progress, but we have a little, well...
You could do that with amputees. You could prove that God exists.
Yes, I'm afraid. With time, maybe. Stem cells and all that are doing well, but I think overplayed still. The other thing before you go to sleep at night, when you remember you come from a single cell, is you say to yourself, however clever I think cells are, that clever.
Well, shall we flip the slide?
Armand's map.
No, that's not it. There it is. Well, when John asked me to produce a map, I was one of the befuddled. I knew just a normal map wouldn't do the trick. Map? What sort of map? Well, so I thought about it, and this is what I came up with. And this is a map, or rather it is two maps that are very dear to my heart. I'm a biologist, as John said, and it is a map about the origin of biology, and it is a map about modern biology and the connection between the two. Modern biology begins more than 2 millennia ago when Aristotle leaves Athens, and he crosses the Aegean Sea and he arrives at an island called Lesbos. As I say, he's 37 and he's just married an 18-year-old. At least we think that she was an 18-year-old because he says the best time for a man to marry is 37, and we know he was 37, and the best time for a woman to marry is 18, and Aristotle was a great man to rationalize his choices. He arrives on this island and he's left Athens and his teacher Plato behind. And he's also left behind, to some degree, the philosophical concerns that he was so preoccupied with, the metaphysical concerns, the concerns of what is the good. He arrives in Lesbos and he turns his eyes to the ground, or more precisely, actually, to the sea. He goes down to the shore of a lagoon, which he speaks about quite often, a lagoon called Pyrrha. That's the word, that's the name he uses for it. And he picks up some snails and fish, and he begins to cut them up, and he writes down what he finds inside. And that is where biology begins. That is the origin of my science, 345 BC, and over the next 40 years of his life, he would write enormous quantities of biology. He founded it, all of it, including, most particularly, Lewis's own special science. In fact, Lewis is intellectually a direct descendant of Aristotle, as I would say. One of the things that Aristotle did is he looked inside a chick embryo for the very first time and watched it develop there, its little heart beating on its bed of yolk. That is exactly what Lewis has done, except Lewis explains how it all works. 10 years ago, I fell in love with Aristotle when I traveled to Lesbos. I was in search of him. I knew that he had done his work in Lesbos, and I wanted to see where. And I was crossing the Aegean, as you do, in a third class in a Greek ferry, had gone up on deck after a sleepless night.
With your 18-year-old?
No, not with my 18-year-old. Entirely in solitude, John. And had gone up on the deck after a sleepless night to have a cigarette, and one of the officers on deck saw me, and he came out and he said, he wanted a light, and so we had a companionable cigarette up there, and he said, what are you doing, where are you going? And I said, Aristotle. And he said, Aristoteles. I said, yes, Aristoteles. He said, you're looking for him? He said, yes, I am. I said, I know he worked on Lesbos at a lagoon, but I don't know where that lagoon is exactly. He said, come inside, come onto the ferry, come onto the bridge. And we rootled through the old maps, and he gave me this map, which this is a picture of the map he gave me, a very old one which they were carrying. I said, don't you need it to drive the boat? He said, no, GPS, it's not a problem. And I took it, and I've treasured it ever since. And it is the map of the lagoon that Aristotle actually worked at, and now it's called Colony, and it's 22 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide and 20 meters deep, and it's a wide, shallow lagoon surrounded by wetlands, and it is one of the loveliest natural places in the world, a perfectly appropriate place to find biology. But what is that thing in the middle? That is my other map. And although it's not immediately apparent, it too has a deep connection with Aristotle. One of Aristotle's greatest ideas was the idea that the thing that animates a creature, the thing that keeps it alive, the thing that is the essence of life, is its soul. Now, that's a strange term, and when I speak of soul, you mustn't think of the Judeo-Christian soul, some sort of gas floating around our head that survives us up to death. For Aristotle, all living things have a soul, plants have souls, and when they die, their soul dies with it. And yet, what is this thing exactly? It's not made of stuff, so it's not made of matter, which makes you a bit suspicious. Is it some sort of vital fluid or something like this? No, it's not. And we all have it, and it's what it is, it appears to be, is the system of organization, how all the parts and the materials of which a creature are made, how they are all related to each other in various ways, and the connections between the parts, and the flow of materials, and the system that regulates that flow of materials, all of which he explicated at great length in his books in a way that is marvelous and ingenious, although I have to say, in the light of modern biology, a little bit weird. All this system Aristotle called the soul, and in fact interpreters of Aristotle, classicists, will often speak of cybernetics and computation by trying to explain what it is that Aristotle would get at. And that's what makes him so wonderful, because these days this is the age of what is called systems biology, the age in which we are precisely trying to put together all the parts of creatures that we previously have torn apart in our dissection-like science. And the way we put it together is by drawing maps. All the parts of a creature, all those complicated molecules, those thousands of molecules and genes and proteins, how are they related to each other? We draw maps. And that is just such a map. That is a map of the regulatory transcriptional apparatus of a yeast cell, superimposed ingeniously with the aid of Photoshop within Aristotle's lagoon. And if I were to put it in a word, I would say that is what Aristotle would call the soul of a yeast cell.
Now, on an hourly basis, we are receiving more and more maps on the Edge website, which John brings together. So one thing we thought is that we could now look at some of those maps. So there was one map between Armand and Louis's map, and that's Eduardo Salcedo Albarian.
Right. He is a social psychologist doing maps of drug cartel people. It's a unique kind of informatics. He lives in Bogota.
Kai Krause?
Kai Krause is with the birth of the personal computer, he became the tool maker, for doing games and graphic visualizations. He now lives in a castle on the Rhine, and comes to England a lot, and is friends with Stephen Fry, and was friends with Douglas Adams, who's passed away.
Is this showing how all of Europe fits into a tiny little bit of Africa?
Right.
Well, I am an African, you must understand. I am a South African. And so I'm quite pleased that you Europeans can all fit into a tiny bit of our continent.
And a lot more besides. There's China, no, and the United States too.
Oh, they're there as well? No.
Yes, they are.
I can't, really, I can't say it right. No, Africa is big, and I love Africa.
We're going to have two actually more contributions later today. We're going to have David Adje and Pancho Guedes, which are both about mapping Africa.
Okay.
Tim Berners-Lee.
Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web. And this is his map of, his impression of the web.
Well, I just make a comment. I looked up before I came out today on the web. What is the oldest map known? Do any of you look this up? I'm the only one who's looked it up. So there's one story, there's a Spanish map in a cave 14,000 years old. They said it took them 15 years to decipher it. If you look at it, it sure as hell doesn't look like a map. But better maps, really, you can see them about several hundred years BC. You can begin to see maps. But the idea that there was one 14,000 years ago, I couldn't make a judgment, but that's what the claim is. Berners-Lee, I think, has changed our lives in such a dramatic way.
So have you.
John, can I just speak to this briefly?
So one of the things you may notice is that many of the maps that we're presenting, and that you'll see here, and that you've just seen in the previous talk, all those wonderful maps of flight paths and so on, is that they all look very, very much alike. And the reason is because they are all networks. So it turns out that in the modern age, when we are flooded by data, not just traffic information, but also biological data, it turns out that networks are a very efficient way of expressing the relationship between things. And so there is a whole body of theory which reaches from traffic to the structure of the web, to the structure of cells, all of which is organized around the mathematics of networks. So you will see these same topologies come up again and again and again. And it turns out that many of these networks actually seem to have deep, deep geometrical similarities between them. It seems that there are some networks which are better than others, and which all structured things have somehow arrived at the same solution, or often arrived at the same solution.
Some of the maps, Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler have a map of the obesity study of the Framingham, in Framingham, Mass, which is totally empirically based, in terms of if you have fat neighbors, you'll be fat, something like that. And then Albert Laszlo Barabasi has a very interesting map. He's one of the key people in network theory, as is Stephen Strogatz, whose group is represented here with Colorati. Sean Carroll's a physicist writing about multiverses. Next.
Douglas Rushkoff.
Media analyst, says program or big program.
John Shire.
Right. She's examining coincidences between culture genes and mood disorders from a paper she wrote. Right. This is the obesity study. That's a famous map. Emanuel Derman is the most famous quant. If you want to blame somebody for what happened on Wall Street, he's probably the first physicist to leave academia and wind up at Goldman Sachs, where he founded the quantitative risk management department and worked there for 17 years.
Would that be why pain is in the center of his map?
Well, there's this whole issue. He's writing a new book called...
That's what it takes to be a banker, but anyway...
Which you'll relate to, is called Models Behaving Badly. But he's talking about computer models. This is the same argument that Freeman Dyson has been making and catching flack for. About global warming. He's not denying there is global warming, but he's attacking the modeling problems. And according to Derman, looking back over what he's helped bring to pass, the model isn't necessarily what's happening on the ground. Next.
He sent several maps.
Yeah, let's go on.
Jennifer Jacquet.
Jennifer Jacquet is a postdoc at University of British Columbia. Oddly, is writing about the nexus of shame and reputation in fish. And Armand has was puzzled by this and has had an email back and forth about the map. I'll let you know.
I can tell you about this because as John said, last night had a bit of a communication with Jennifer about this, who's a wonderful social scientist, theorist who works in British Columbia and who cares about fish. She wants to save fish. And she's working with a world-famous oceanographer called Daniel Paulet. So what she has noticed is that as we fish down the food chain and we come to ever more unattractive fish, we change their names. So there are fish which are known as lumpsuckers or wharfish, warfish, and there was some very strange one. It was maybe it was a stone sucker or something like this. Anyway, there are lots of traditionally unattractive names for fish, and yet in order to make them palatable, what we do is we rename them. And hence the quote here from Jarret, which says, if you can't change the facts, then change the words. And that is the spirit of this map. And what it is about this notion that she's observed, this phenomenon she's observed in fish about changing their names in order, as it were, to conceal their origins or to make them more palatable. This is how we change the names of so many things. We call the global war on terror, and then we change it to overseas contingency. We have a girl called Stephanie Germanotta, and she turns out to be Lady Gaga. Love Scientists, Federation of American Scientists, AIG, an insurance company which went bust, is that right? I think so. AIU Holdings, there we go, the stump knocker, apparently a fish which is hardly palatable under that name, is now called the spotted sunfish, and so on. It is a map of what she calls guilt or shame, a map of euphemisms. The general.
Well, I mean, it's just that this is not the time, but as you probably know, you can map the brain very beautifully, and the sensory thing, in other words, in a part of your brain, there's a region which responds to the tips of your toes, to the tips of your nose, and it's all beautifully mapped onto the brain. And the other thing that I want to know about the map of the brain is, as I grow old, I fail to recognize friends that I know. How do we map faces into the brain? And I don't think they can tell us that yet.
Change their names.
I should say that this is, I think, a bit of a take on the kinds of maps.
We're just seeing the map.
No, you're right.
Sorry,
but just number 1 and 2 are good breast, bad breast. So
it's
not entirely clear how this map. But anyway.
Craig Venter?
Craig Venter announced the artificial, the first synthetic cell in April. I was there in Washington. It was almost a very quiet announcement in terms of its reception, but I think we're going to be seeing a lot of this map.
I'm afraid mapping of DNA and mapping of genes is very important. I find it unbelievably boring, and I find genes beyond belief boring. They code for proteins, and it's proteins that make your cells function.
Next. Gino Segre is presenting a temperature map of the universe 400,000 years after the Big Bang.
Ties in nicely with Amory Sala's map yesterday, which was an art map about temperatures. Bruce Sterling.
This is Bruce's literary map.
You can see all these maps on the Edge website if you want to spend more time. Lawrence C. Smith.
Lawrence Smith young researcher, works for Jared Diamond. Has this theory which he calls the New North, that with climate change, it's not all bad. It's going to be very, very good, and for people that live in Newfoundland or Finland or parts of Russia, and it just shows how there's going to be like a northern rim of countries by the year 2050, which will be their habitation of which will be much improved, and you're going to want to live up there. So, thanks.
Cesar Hidalgo.
This is his map of the world economy, about industrial development. He works with Barabasi, and Barabasi just came out with a new book. He's the author of Linked and Bursts, 2 books you might want to read. Next.
Yeah, Matthew Ritchie was in our experiment marathon. He's a visual artist who works a lot also with science and architecture. And that's one of his maps about the layers of historical narratives onto contemporary physical structures and performances. I think he was working with Neil Turok also, whom you know well, John, no?
George Dyson lives in Bellingham, Washington, and builds by dockers, Indian canoes, and spends a lot of time by himself navigating through the islands off the coast. This is a deceptive map of islands that were deliberately misplaced to mess up competitors for trading companies that were competing against each other in the 18th century. Okay, next.
Marina Abramovic, she explained her map yesterday. It's basically her family, the map of her family, mapping the family. John Baldessari is a found photograph, which he's not sure where he found it, but he supposes it's from a movie, and it's a map of a swamp. John Baldessari was also part of our experiment marathon, where he transformed a glass of water into a glass of wine, back into a glass of water. Leroi Oxman.
Leroi is an architect and a designer at MIT's Media Lab. This is an artwork.
George Smoot.
George Smoot won the Nobel Prize for the Kobe satellite, the background, cosmic background radiation. This is a space-time of our observable universe.
Brian Knudsen.
He's a psychologist at Stanford. It's a value map of brain regions and expectation of anticipation of how much money people are going to make.
Albie Ray Smith.
Albie Ray Smith is a legendary figure who has, more than anyone, created the field called computer graphics. So there's been many different places where he's actually started departments and companies like Pixar, Microsoft, but even way before that, everybody considers him the founder. This is the DNA of Roman emperors and their associates. Danny Hillis is the man who broke the von Neumann bottleneck by inventing the massively parallel computer, which gives us the World Wide Web and companies like Google, etc. He did this in the 70s. And his computer, the connection machine, was for about 10 years the fastest computer in the world. And the Cold War ended. The only customer was the government, and they stopped buying them, and the government wouldn't allow him to sell the company to the Japanese. So he went to work for Disney because he likes making toys. Right now, we just had an Edge Masterclass in Napa last month. Hillis was the lecturer, and he is one of 11 scientists that have been nominated by National Cancer Institute to be principal investigators to rethink cancer. Each of these people, Paul Davies, a physicist, being another one in Arizona, are working with an established cancer expert, but the non-cancer specialists are calling the shots. And what he's studying is proteomics, which Lewis was mentioning, looking at proteins. And right under, if you go on the Edge homepage, right under the maps and the homage to Mandelbrot, you'll have access to the first lecture. And the second one goes up in about a week.
Bruce Parker.
Bruce Parker was the chief scientist of NOAA, National Oceanic Administration, for 25 years, basically in charge of the ocean research for the government. This is a really interesting map about the first 12 hours of the tsunami in 2004 and how it hit and the effects it had. His other claim to fame is that his son, Sean Parker, is portrayed by Jason Timberlake in the Facebook movie. Sean is the co-founder of Napster and Facebook. Pretty interesting accomplishment. Stuart Pym is an environmental researcher. studying diversity. Is that Duke?
Carlo Ratti is an architect and engineer at MIT, and it's one of the many maps of his, which is actually a map he made of Great Britain. Nicholas Humphrey.
Yeah, Nicholas Humphrey is a very distinguished psychologist at Cambridge, living in Cambridge. This is a found image painted on the wall of a cave in Spain, which he says 15,000 years ago.
Jenny Jardin.
Jenny Jardin is known as the Queen of the Internet. She is a co-founder of Boing Boing, which is a very popular high-tech blog and very trippy and interesting. And this is a map of content areas that appear on the site.
Christopher Stringer.
Chris Stringer is one of Britain's great scientists. For years, he and Milford Wolpert and others were duking it out over the origin of Neanderthals. It was Stringer's African Eve theory versus Wolpert's multi-regional program. I was working with both of them, and neither of them talked to each other, so it made life very interesting. Stringer won, by the way. You're African. He's now in charge of this historical, the Ancient Human Occupation of Britain project. It's looking at ancient origins of Britain, and the map is a time 900,000 years ago when there was no English Channel, and Britain was connected to France, and every 30,000 years the ice cap would come down and everybody would go south. He actually predicted this would happen again about 20 years ago, and it didn't.
Here is Dimitar Saselov.
Yeah, he is a favorite Bulgarian. He's an astrophysicist who studies exoplanets and runs a new institute at Harvard, which is, I don't know the name of the institute, but go ahead.
Well, we're going to have a contribution from him just after this panel, because he actually sent us an audio contribution to the marathon, so we'll hear more from him.
Young Johan is one of Laszlo Barabasi's colleagues. And this is a really interesting map about connecting foods. Garrett Lisi is an independent theoretical physicist who was profiled in The Yorker, mostly about his surfing endeavors.
John Barrow.
John Barrow, you probably all know about. He's a cosmologist, physicist, mathematician at Cambridge, and he actually knows a lot about maps. He couldn't make it today. This is the London subway map that other people have alluded to. Harry Beck's remake of it after it was failing. Mark Pagels is an evolutionary biologist at Reading.
Let me just say, John, I thought this was an absolutely fantastic map. I mean, so the size of the words are in proportion to their antiquity, which Pagel infers using computational tools, rather like those which we reconstruct evolutionary history of animals with. And who would have guessed that thou, rather than I, is the oldest word that we can detect? I wouldn't have. I think it's delightful.
Richard Saul Werman. He founded TED.
Right. Richard Saul Werman is a polymathic, brilliant designer, organizer. He's the founder of the TED conference, which he sold 10 years ago, but he remains active in the world of design. And he actually owns and runs another conference called TED Med, which follows the same theme, but focuses on medical issues. Juan Enriquez is a researcher who basically is a venture capitalist, but he also was a founding director at Harvard Business School's Life Sciences Project. He works closely with Venter, and this is a study of the speciation of religions and why 90% of them disappear and their gods go extinct, and why some of them last.
I think it's an interesting map. I think it really is.
Well, it's a map that is, of course, conceptually very similar to the one that Pagel showed about the words, because it's also about the evolutionary relationships of cultural artifacts to each other, in effect. And it is mapped upon one of Ernst Haeckel's maps of animals, so it's quasi-fictitious, and but it certainly gets the idea across. And it tells us that there are deep evolutionary relationships between so many things, and the logic of the cultural diversity we see in the world is not very different from that of biological diversity. At least that's what I take from it.
Very good.
Yeah.
That's basically a map which John Mader, who is actually very related to Casey Rias, whose lecture we're going to have later today. And when he was in London, he decided to not use a computer at all, but to draw his map on a little piece of paper. And that's basically a map he made of the future.
George Church is the other half of the odd couple, the first half being Dr. Venter. George and Craig were the featured speakers at an EDGE conference called Life, What a Concept, in 2007, which, if anyone cares to read it on EDGE, really set the agenda for what was going to happen in the next 5 years. He's the head of the Personal Genome Project. He's a brilliant professor, lecturer at Harvard, and is connected to everything that's happening in the field of genes and genomics. This is a roadmap for eliminating viruses from industrial microbes and possibly agriculture and humans.
I can try to explain it briefly. Do we have time? So our genome, our genes, they run on a particular code, which is required to interpret the content of those genes into functional proteins. Viruses use the same code, and the reason they do is because they co-opt our molecular machinery in order to reproduce themselves. So what Church is trying to do, this is a diagram of our code and other possible codes. And he wants, as far as I can gather, to engineer a creature which runs on a different code, which will therefore be immune to viruses. And the hint at the bottom of this, we're using this map to design and construct new genomes, new codes, and where did he say it? Possibly we can do this with humans. But yes, eliminating viruses, possibly agricultural humans. He's talking about re-engineering our genetic code at the most fundamental level. We should probably move on.
Next.
Just one more word about John Mader. What is kind of interesting, because that's actually true for many of the maps. It's also true for Kevin Kelly, who sort of hand drew the internet. Is that kind of a lot of hand-drawn maps are coming in, and John Mader, being one of the pioneering graphic designers and computer scientists using mostly digital maps, was a very big surprise to get these hand map. Maybe it's somehow got to do with something Umberto Eco pointed out the other day in an article he wrote, where he said it's a protest against the disappearance of handwriting. Jonas Mekas' map of New York City.
Jonas Mekas is the reason we're all here, is because he hired me in 1965 to run to organize the expanded cinema festival at Filmmakers Cinematheque, and that's how I started working with artists and learned about science. Next.
Alexander Kluge, that film director and author, came out of the DLD Congress. He basically says that digital information is a garden. He thinks the internet is a garden, so he made this map of a garden of information.
Yeah, I just should add, going back to Jonas, that it's not about me. He is the father of underground movies and just a major force in the developing avant-garde arts in the 60s and 70s.
Has just done a book with Gerhard Richter, So Many Bridges to Art. John Tooby?
John Tooby, University of California, Santa Barbara, is the father of evolutionary psychology. And here he's mapping the undiscovered commitments of the mind.
Let me just speak about that, John. So,
Continents, excuse me.
What's this?
Continents of the mind.
Undiscovered continents of the mind. So, Tooby believes that our minds consist of modules. This is a very important idea for him. And
so does Pinker.
Sorry?
So does Pinker.
And so does Pinker. Many evolutionary psychologists believe this, although it's, I think, moderately controversial. Other people believe that the mind is a more flexible, open processing machine. But over here, he really believes that very particular tasks are located in very particular parts of our minds, or even particular parts of our brains in a very modular way. So for him, the task of mapping the continent of the mind is a task of working out the relationship between those modules. And I think that that's what this is all about. Is that a fair statement? Yeah.
But there is evidence for modular nature of the mind.
Certainly.
I mean, if you destroy quite a small part of the brain, you can't use tools, for example, and it's argued that that little part of the brain is modular for tool use.
The third feature on Edge 14 years ago was Pinker's feature, Organs of Computation. It's not an accident that Tooby was Pinker's advisor. And it was probably the most controversial piece we've ever run. You know, and we just had to stop it because everybody was spending their time fighting with each other about it.
Here is a motional space map of Olafur Eliasson. It's basically his way also of mapping time.
Okay.
One of the leading artists. We have Maurizio Cattelan, his map of different geographies.
This is Laszlo Barabasi's map of diseases linking to each other because of shared genes. He calls it the diseasome.
Just as a word here, so you will see in biology the suffix "ome" attached to almost everything. It began with genome, then it was transcriptome, proteome for the proteins. It just means the collective of everything. And once you work that out, actually, you find that the suffix "ome" is actually applicable to almost anything. We are here the Serpentine ome, or the Map Marathon ome. Yes, indeed.
Aaron Kobling, artist and also graphic designer, who did an amazing talk yesterday, who is here with us, was also part of the DLD conference. So for all of those of you who want to see the speech, that's on the DLD website. That's the map I mentioned before, Kevin Kelly.
Kevin Kelly is the original executive editor at Wired and still connected as the big ideas guy. And I think this doesn't have a title, but it's his reference map for what he's dealing with every day in his world.
And that's it. Now we have RACS, the RACS Media Collective, Artist Collective, artists and activists from India. That is their map of the world.
I think this will keep going.
Timothy Taylor.
Timothy Taylor was, he's an archaeologist at University of Bradford. This is his take on the artificial ape. He gave his own performance last night under, what do you call it?
He had a pseudonym. His alter ego.
His alter ego, Christina von Tautendorf.
Syrian Sumner?
Syrian Sumner was here 3 years ago at the Experimental Marathon. She had all the audience wearing bags over their heads and playing the roles of various kinds of ants. This is her map of social behavior, dealing with social aspects of insect instincts.
Eric Weinstein.
Eric Weinstein is another quant, mathematician, economist, and
Tom Standage.
Tom Standage is currently is the editor of the back of the book of The Economist, and also the editor of the online edition. And he writes these wonderful histories. One was called The Victorian Internet. This is a map of the internet in 1901.
And that's it. So, we speak about Sasselov for a minute. Thank you very, very much to John, to Louis, and to Armand for this extraordinary contribution. And again, thanks also to all the EDGE contributors to the EDGE community for the maps which keep coming in. We now actually have a break, which is a 50 minutes break, but in this break we're going to have an audio contribution by Dimitar Sasselov. John has already mentioned him. The extraordinary Dimitar Sasselov has actually contributed also to the Serpentine's Park Night program this year. He did a conversation about astronomy and photography with Wolfgang Tillmans during our summer exhibition as one of the park nights this summer. Dimitar cannot be with us today, but he sent his contributions. So for those of you who can stay, that will be in the next 15 minutes. He's somebody introduced to us also by John Brockman. And there's maybe one last question I had to all of you, which is actually something Dimitar brought up. And it's very interesting because when Dimitar was here in July and August, he said you really need to speak to Benoit Mandelbrot about maps. It's the key person in the United States to talk to about maps. And he said Benoit Mandelbrot was somehow not his neighbor, but I think he's a relative's neighbor.
His son's neighbor.
His son's neighbor, so he saw Benoit Mandelbrot very regularly. So he went back to the US and actually spoke to Benoit the next week about maps. And Benoit came up with this very interesting question. He said almost everything is a map. We can look at this table and we can say that's a map. So the question is, what is not a map? I was very curious if any of you had an answer to this question. What is not a map?
You're not a map. I'm terribly sorry, I don't accept this idea that everything is a map. Certainly not.
No, but I will.
Sorry.
Well, that's certainly true, but there's no doubt about it that the notion of what a map is has expanded enormously. And in networks, the kinds of things that we've been seeing over here, which don't represent spatial information at all, but other more abstract relationships. People speak about the functional cartography of the genome and the functional cartography of the proteome all the time. It simply has to be an abstract representation, usually visual, of some system that has some correspondence to the real world. So not everything is a map, but
not everything is a PowerPoint slide either.
But not everything.
In terms of the kind of conferences that people go to today, it's all about slides and the visuals, and the picture takes on a much bigger meaning. Wittgenstein had this great line, "A picture held us captive." And sometimes they're just lies. The whole thing is wrong. The idea of trying to visualize it and put it on a flat screen.
I guess the question is, as maps become ever more detailed and they approach reality, the real world, and they will, the question is, when do we actually cease to see the map as opposed to reality when they're almost perfectly isomorphic with each other?
I think we get on the boat and go to Lesbos.
Indeed.
And ask Aristotle.
I don't think diagrams are maps. In other words, if you have a diagram of of mechanics, that's not a map, it's a diagram.
I think that's changing.
But what's interesting also is that most of these scientists, at least when we do things on EDGE, we ask people to relate it to their empirical work. They don't have to be scientists, but it's not just self-expression. And it'd be interesting to contrast the maps of people that are just coming out of the arts as opposed to the sciences, and to see if there's a difference. I just don't know how the empiricism shows itself, in a lot of these works.
That could not be a better conclusion. Thank you very, very much, John Brockman. Thank you very, very much, Louis Wolpert. Thank you very, very much, Armand Leroi. Thank you.